Path of Exile 3.24 Necropolis League is right around the corner. This is the largest overhaul to the endgame that we've gotten in quite some time, and while it is not a completely new endgame, there's tons of new things to do, tier 17 maps, new boss fights, a reworked atlas that focuses more on scarabs now, and a ton of other good stuff to look forward to. And as always, on every league start, you're going to need a good league start build, and I've gone ahead and done all the work for you and collected what I feel are the top 5 league start builds of 3.24. For most of these builds, I've got multiple options for you from different content creators that focus on different things. So just about everybody should be able to find a build that they enjoy out of this list and have an excellent league start, no matter what you intend to do. Now, while I personally am not going to be releasing any league starters this league, I've unfortunately been a bit too busy IRL, and I don't have a ton of control over that. I will still be making content throughout the league as things calm down for me IRL, hopefully. So if you enjoy this video or my content in general, make sure to give this video a like and make sure to subscribe so you can keep up to date with all of the latest videos that I will be putting out for 3.24. And without further ado, let's get into it. Starting off, as always, we have Pox's Righteous Fire Chieftain, or Inquisitor, or Juggernaut. Now, I'm not going to go very in-depth in this one because this is a pretty tried and true classic at this point. However, I do want to make sure that you are aware that if you are a brand new player and you want your hand held better than anyone else is capable of, I highly suggest that you take a look at Righteous Fire and you go to pox.net. This is essentially the Righteous Fire wiki at this point, and there is more information on this website than pretty much any other build in the entirety of PoE. I mean, basically any possible question that you would ever have about Righteous Fire is covered. There is a ton of content here. If you're interested in what the build looks like, this is what Righteous Fire is. It is an aura of fire around you that just burns enemies that you're nearby. It is very low APM, meaning you're not gonna have to press a bunch of buttons. Pox is a great guy, he's got a great guide. However, as one downside of this is if you are not a new player, if you are someone who is experienced, who likes a more in-depth build, you like it to be a little bit interactive, or maybe has some like higher ceiling or faster cleared dreams, maybe doing some bossing, probably not the build for you these days. Next on the list, an old classic has been revamped, and we are getting Archmage Heirophant back as a build type. Now, you might remember way back in the day I played like a Archmage Ball Lightning Ascendant. Archmage has been fundamentally changed to not scale with increased mana cost, but to scale off of your maximum mana. This essentially solves every problem that the mana archetype has had, and Archmage builds should be extremely powerful going forward because they will synergize very well with the Hierophant. Now, we've got 2 build archetypes here. The first one is going to be from Palstron. This is an Archmage Ball Lightning Hierophant. Now, this ability is relatively easy to pilot. It does very good damage. It is relatively easy to gear. Now, any Archmage Hierophant that you play is going to have a decent amount of upkeep. There's a decent amount of buttons that you're going to have to press. You can no longer put instant skills on your left click this patch anymore, and realistically, you probably won't be able to automate Arcane Cloak too easily. It's going to make you lose links, and that might be a little bit more difficult to deal with. However, Palstron's version is very easy to gear, very easy to pilot, and it should have an extremely high damage ceiling with a lot of gear. This is more of a softcore oriented build, or for people who are relatively experienced with the game and want something that can scale relatively well. Now, on the opposite side of things when it comes to Archmage Heirophant, we do have Garotha's Ice Nova Frostbolt Hierophant. This is a very, very similar concept, but implemented in a very different way. This is using a 2-button setup, which means that you're going to be casting Frostbolts and then casting Ice Novas off of those Frostbolts. This has higher damage early on, but with the way that Garotha's POB is set up, it potentially caps out at a little bit lower damage than what Palstron's is going to be able to provide. This also is a 2-button playstyle on top of all of the other buttons that you're going to have to press, so do keep in mind that this will be a little bit more square fingers than the Ball Lightning version of it might end up being. Now, this version of the build is extremely tanky. It goes into spell suppression as well as a bunch of armor and all kinds of other scaling. But as I said previously, for softcore play, the provided setup here by Garotha is going to have a lower cap on damage. If you are a newer player, for the Palstron version, there is a max roll guide that is going to be able to hold your hand a little bit better going through the early stages of gearing this character, getting everything complete and all that kind of good stuff. And I will say, on top of everything else, this archetype can probably be played with most spells that have somewhat effectiveness of added damage. Archmage is an archetype where it adds a bunch of damage to the spell, and it doesn't really matter what that base spell is. That's the reason people play things like Ball Lightning, is just that it's very effective when it comes to damage. One thing to keep in mind about this is that I do believe this archetype will be very popular. Mana builds, when they were in meta, were extremely popular, and they probably will be popular again. So some of the uniques and base pieces could have a slightly inflated rate because of that, so keep that in mind, that some of this gear might be a little bit expensive very early on, and you might want to play this as a second build, or just be ready to farm a little bit more than you might have to for a non-meta build. Next on the list, we have Lightning Arrow or bow-based Deadeyes. This is the premier softcore trade farming build. This is the one. It's the same exact type of archetype that I've been playing for 3 or 4 leagues now. It's the same archetype that I'm going to be playing this league. I'm not going to be putting out my own build guide for this. I simply just don't have time at the moment. However, I'm going to be making this, turning it into some kind of wander, and we'll see how that goes. This is the build that if you are wanting to farm a whole bunch of money early on in the league, this is the one. It's not insanely tanky, so be careful about that. You're not going to be able to just rush into bosses and face tank it and not have to worry about anything like that. It's not that kind of build. This is the kind of build where you stay at range, you try to stay alive, and deal damage to things essentially off screen. One really good thing about this archetype is that it is super popular, and there will be a ton of leftover gear that you can just snatch up from people who are essentially selling off their old gear on the trade website for probably a lot cheaper than whatever they made it for. So you should be able to gear this character for cheap, especially if you're slower, if you are a newer player or someone who can't get to, you know, like red maps on day 1 or something like that. Do keep in mind, this is not a good fit for a bossing character. You can maybe get 2 Watchstones done, and if you're really experienced, you might be able to kill like Maven and Uber Elder, but besides that, you're really going to be mostly mapping, and if you want to do any kind of bossing, you're probably going to need to swap this into a different build or start up a second build after you've already gotten all of your money. Now, the footage you've been seeing in the background right here is Crouching Tunas. This is going to be a more newer player-friendly version of this guide. It's more thorough. It's going to have a max roll guide if you like that kind of thing. This version does use ballistas for single target, meaning it is going to have a second ability that you'll have to use to kill those very strong enemies. And it probably is going to be a little bit safer than the other versions that are going to be listed here. If you're a newer player, if you are less confident in yourself when it comes to this kind of build, I do suggest going with Tunas. If you are more experienced, there is Fubgun's version, which is going to be using Mana Forged Arrows instead of a Ballista, and transitions into Magic Find setups later on. This is a very late game, experienced player kind of focused build, so do be careful about following Fubgun if you are relatively new. You might end up getting a little bit in over your head. However, if you want to make a ton of money, if Magic Find is the kind of thing that you enjoy, Fubgun's probably the guy to be following for that, and I do highly recommend that you follow essentially anything that he says, if Magic Find is the thing that you want to do. Lastly, we have Havoc. Now, he doesn't have a full build guide out this league yet, but he does have some early league stuff that he's been showing off. Havoc is a racer, and he's probably the most knowledgeable when it comes to getting through the campaign as quickly as possible. If that kind of thing seems interesting for you and you want to kind of have the most complete understanding of how to zoom through the campaign really fast, Havoc is probably the one to follow. However, do keep in mind, this is probably not super good for new players because this is really going to be focused on min-maxing as quickly through the campaign and through maps as you possibly can get. Now, unfortunately, he doesn't have the full build guide out, so I can't link to it, but I will link whatever is available down in the description for now. Next on the list is going to be Detonate Dead, and there are 2 very different approaches to how this build is going to be played here, so I don't have any generic notes. I've got different notes depending on which version of the build we're talking about. First off, we're going to talk about I'm Exile's Detonate Dead of Chain Reaction Necromancer. This is a tried and true playstyle that has by large been called the best build to league start with for I couldn't even tell you how many leagues. However, it is a 2-button playstyle, and this can have a bit of a frustrating effect for a lot of people. It's got a lot of conditionals, but if you're okay with a bit of a more in-depth playstyle, It's probably one of the best early map blasters that you can possibly get, that's also tanky, also is capable of doing some bossing, albeit a little bit slower, and doesn't really have to worry too much about dying as long as it's played even somewhat well. Now, on the opposite end, we have Rutu's Cast on Crit, Detonate Dead of Chain Reaction Inquisitor. And this build is honestly just kind of broken. This is probably gonna be like the build of the league starter of the league, if I had to guess, to be honest with you. It just is a very simply broken setup. It does tons of damage, requires very little gear, is super tanky, and it scales pretty much up enough to do all content in the game. Maybe besides some like super high-end Valdos, but Rue might figure out a way to get that to work anyways. Now, one thing is that Rue does not make videos. He doesn't really make full guides on anything. However, Ventrua has made a guide, which is what you're watching right here, about this build. It's got some league start stuff. It has all the information that you'll need, so you should be able to have a good time with league starting this. But do be aware, although this is probably like top 3 most powerful league starters that you could possibly ever have right now, it's a little bit complicated, a little bit strange, and if you are a very new player, it's probably going to be a little bit overwhelming for you, as there's a lot of moving parts when it comes to how this build works. So do keep that in mind. On top of that, like I said, Rue does not make videos, so this is going to be what's linked down below. You will also get a link to the video from Ventrua, but he basically just makes like Google Docs and has a bunch of builds in here, so you can look through these if you like. There's a bunch of POBs that are going to be available. Now, last on the list, we have Explosive Trap. This is mostly going to be a bossing build, and it is a trap build, so keep this in mind when I talk about trap builds. They do have a bit of a delayed function to their damage, and a lot of people don't like that playstyle. However, when it comes to early bossing builds, this is one of the better ones that is available. Now, there's 2 versions of the build that I have linked here, which is going to be Zizaran's version, which is what you're seeing here, as well as Fearless Dumbo's version, which is what you're going to be seeing here. Zizaran's is more hardcore oriented, gonna be a little bit tankier, better for not dying. Fearless Dumbo's is going to be quite a bit better for high-end farming, softcore, like boss rushing and all those kinds of things, and is probably a much more in-depth guide than what Zizaran is going to be providing, because Dumbo has basically only been playing Explosive Trap for like the last 4 or 5 months, I think, and has done a pretty good job in that regard. But it isn't going to be a hardcore safe build, and you probably will die occasionally, especially if you're not playing too well. And that is going to be it for the video. Hopefully you're able to find something to play for League Start here. There's a ton of other builds out there, but these are the ones that I think are probably a step above the rest when it comes to either interesting new concepts, tried and true classic builds that we know are going to be absolutely amazing, and builds for a variety of different purposes. So I hope you guys have a good League Start for 3.24. I will be streaming live on Twitch as always when it comes to the initial League Start. You'll also see me here on YouTube, of course, as well. Probably going to be playing some kind of bow into a kinetic blaster or something in that regard, but we'll see what happens with League Start when it comes to my personal plans. So remember, boys, if you enjoyed this content, make sure to give this video a like, subscribe to the YouTube channel, hit that notification bell to stay up to date with all the latest videos, and stay safe out there in Rayclast. And I'll see you guys in the next video.